In Affliction League, with the arrival of the Wildwood Ascendancies, I knew I had to play the new Warlock. Using Warlock, I decided to stack life and use Reap as my main skill that I would carry to endgame. The process was horribly painful, but I actually ended up playing this as my only character this league to level 100 through purely mapping, downing all Uber bosses, and completing 38 of 40 challenges. All in all, I think for how low my expectations of the build were compared to already existing Reap builds that destroy endgame, it ended up being pretty satisfying to build out and make work. This is a life-stacking Reap build. It's a self-cast build, so I have no way of automating this. I cast every single Reap manually. This is a life stacker that makes use of the new cannibalized faith life cost scaling from the Warlock Wildwood Ascendancy. That's new to Affliction League, as well as leveraging Crimson Power to increase our life values through scaling Energy Shield on our gear to push our life a little bit higher than you would be able to through normal life affixes, as well as still benefiting from life normally. It's a pure fire conversion crit build, and I chose that simply because it's the most easily accessible conversion method, thanks to Avatar of Fire easily available on the tree, and through the Fire Mastery, giving us 40% in all the gloves. And prior to that, I was simply using a Volconis Demon Dagger unique, which gave me 50% fire conversion, and that was a really useful stopgap method because it synergizes with the Inquisitor's Instruments of Virtue Ascendancy to help carry me through the mid-game until I was able to get better gear. And this is purely a hit-based build, meaning I don't care about ignites, and I have no other way of scaling damage other than hitting harder and hitting faster. And so by using a Scepter with Secrets of Suffering, and Curses, Flammability, and Elemental Weakness to reduce the resistances of enemies, as well as applying Exposure with gloves, and covering them in ash from one of the unique jewels, that which was taken, dropped by King of the Mists in the Wildwood. I have a chance to cover rare or unique enemies in ash on hit, and that provides me with the ability to reduce resistances and increase damage taken significantly, scaling the pure hit damage of our Reap, which is purely fire. And all this life stacking does two things. It allows us to be more liberal with our use of Reap, because we scale the life cost on Reap to do extra damage, as well as use Wrathpith Globe, the unique shield that provides 5% spell damage per 100 maximum life, as well as 5% critical strike chance to spells per 100 maximum life. And as you can imagine, if you can see my life globe, it chunks quite hard. And so we need methods of mitigating that. To that end, I chose to use Dissolution of the Flesh unique jewel. This allows me to use my life as a resource, because I don't take life damage, it is purely reserved. There are video resources, notably from Dreamcore and Captain Lance, that will go over how Dissolution of the Flesh works. And combined with Eternal Youth, the red portion of my life globe regenerates via ES, meaning I regenerate a base 33% of my life every second. And I also have Leech using a Vitality Watcher's Eye, which allows me to scale all my hit damage into Leech. So all in all, I'm bleaching about maybe 1500 life per second whenever I hit per Leech instance. And then I have the Eternal Youth, which is replenishing my life, allowing me to maintain the life cost and avoid those instances where I run out of red life and I kind of stutter when I cast, rather than constantly swinging. Look at my gear. I'm using Energy Shield on all of my bases. This is to scale life using Crimson Power, the node from the Warlock Wildwood Ascendancy tree. And the stats I'm looking for on my gear are quite straightforward. I'm simply looking for Energy Shield, life, resistances, physical taking as elemental, critical strike multiplier, cast speed, and personally, intelligence, just to make sure that my intelligence meets or exceeds my strength so that I can create profaned ground from the Rational Doctrine Jewel. Rational Doctrine also allows my consecrated ground and profane ground to linger, meaning that I do not need to take the pious path notable on the Ascendancy for Inquisitor. Aside from that, I'm using the alternating scepter base, which gives me Secrets of Suffering, allowing my critical strikes to scorch. Before this, I was using the unique cluster jewel, the interrogation, and allocating Secrets of Suffering on my tree. I'm no longer doing that since the scepter provides that. The elephant in the room is the Mageblood belt. This is totally optional. I bought it because I had the currency to try and scale this build a little bit further. But prior to this, I was using a Stygian Vice with Hunter Influence. It had life and life percent on it, as well as some resistances. And before that, it was just a leather belt with a tier 1 life roll and some resistances, so this doesn't matter too much. With that said, before I used Mageblood, my flask setup looked a little bit different because I made use of Taste of Hate, as well as Rumi's Concoction, just for a little bit more survivability before I had the Mageblood slotted in. And the anointment I've chosen to use is Whispers of Doom, because this allows me to use 2 curses, elemental weakness, and flammability in tandem attached to a Arcanist brand. So in my main 6 link on my body, I have Reap attached to a life tap, Awakened Added Fire, Awakened Spell Cascade, Awakened Spell Echo, and increased critical damage support. Of all of these jewels, or skill gems, the only 2 that really matter are life tap support, to help scale our life cost meaningfully, as well as Awakened Spell Cascade. Awakened Spell Cascade adds a repeat, or not a repeat, but a copy of the spell behind, in front, and to the sides of the spell you cast, which is why when I cast Reap, you will see 5 instances of Reap. The reason that this is important is because 1, it gives us a ton of clear. It hits a lot more of the screen rather than 1 circle in front, or with regular spell cascade in front and behind. More importantly, if I hold this out, you'll see that these overlap ever so slightly in the middle, meaning that this allows us to, I wouldn't call it shotgun, but overlap the circles, and this effect allows us to hit anywhere between 1 to 4 times depending on where the enemy is in these casts. And if you can get them directly in the sweet spot in the middle of those overlaps, you can hit 3, sometimes 4 times depending on where you cast, how big the enemy is, and where they are in relation to you. So it's a little strange in that you need to pay attention to where you cast, because overlapping is super important and where the bulk of your damage comes from, because hitting with just 1 circle does minimal damage compared to overlapping them with that lovely overlap in the middle. I'm using Val Reap, increased duration support. This is a powerful cooldown. It just allows us to get more blood charges. Blood charges on Reap allow us to get more damage per blood charge, as well as more spell damage per blood charge, and by using Val Reap, we get 9 blood charges, meaning our life cost is astronomically high, and we get a ton of bonus damage from the Warlock Ascendancy, and I can show that later in the POB when we have 9 blood charges, because it almost doubles our damage, which is incredible. My gloves, I have my auras, I have Vitality. This was useful early on before I transitioned to Dissolution of the Flesh. Now I just use it so I can get the life leech from a Watcher's Eye that has leech on it. Damage leech does life while affected by Vitality. I have Petrified Blood. The damage over time doesn't really matter too much since we regen and leech so much, and so this just mitigates a ton of the hit damage we take. And my damage auras are Herald of Purity and Herald of Ash. And Herald of Purity acts as a almost pseudo-defensive layer, because since I use the Dissolution of the Flesh, the minions allow the mobs to aggro on them, and they block projectiles. They just give me a little bit of a reprieve while mapping and doing content, so that I can get those 2 seconds to not take damage and replenish that life that I've reserved from taking damage because of dissolution. In my boots, I have Immortal Call attached to cast 1 damage taken. This is my guard skill, it's automated. And I chose Immortal Call because I don't have any armor, so Molten Shell is useless, out of the question. And Steel Skin because it only mitigates about 2000 damage at max level. I get a lot more value out of Immortal Call when I'm taking burst damage, because even though it's only 1 second long, that 1 second will mitigate a lot more damage thanks to my enormous life pool, where I tank through just sheer amount of life and petrified blood. And it has felt much better ever since I switched into Immortal Call. And Zealotry attached to Eternal Blessing is my final aura. This disables all reservations that are on mana, but since I'm running Blood Magic as well as Sanguimancy, I have no mana. So this is a free aura, and I chose Zealotry to create critical or consecrated ground when I hit a rare or unique enemy, and then I can scale up the damage that enemies take while on consecrated ground thanks to Bottled Faith and that which was taken. In my weapon, I have an Arcanist brand with both my curses. I throw this out, attaches to an enemy, throws both curses. There is a strange interaction that doesn't normally matter, is when you cast with the brand, it'll cost your normal resource. So it will drain your life, because with Wrathpith Globe, anytime you cast or trigger a spell skill, you lose 10% of your life. And because Arcanist Brand counts as casting a spell, as it fires off the curses, you'll see your red life deplete. This does not actually put you in danger, but what it will do is it will deplete your resource for casting. So sometimes, certain circumstances, especially on maps with less regen, you'll notice that your regen and leech are not overcoming the amount of life you're losing from Wrathpith Globe, and so you'll like stutter a little bit when casting until your Arcanist brand falls off and you're able to replenish and leech the life back. My movement skill is Lightning Warp, attached to less duration, Swift Affliction, and faster casting. Lightning Warp with enough cast speed and reduced duration feels really good. It goes quite far, feels near instant, and is really good for traveling great distances rather quickly, and has helped me speed up my Uber Shaper kills significantly. Prior to that, I was actually using Frost Blink of Wintry Blast, the new transfigured version, attached to Spell Echo and faster casting. If you haven't seen it, Frost Blink of Wintry Blast has a cast time, but no cooldown, meaning you can use it kind of like a replacement for Shield Charge or Flame Dash. With enough cast speed, it feels pretty good to move around and blink over stuff with absolutely no cast time. And for absolute emergencies, when you need an instant cast, when you're getting hit in a pack of mobs, and you need to escape, and need to go a little bit further, I have a second Frost Blink when I'm moving, and that'll get me out of danger, because I can use that without worry about being stunned or rooted or anything. Taking a look at the Ascendancies, we'll start with the Inquisitor. The first node I took was Sanctuary. Consecrated ground you create applies increased damage taken to enemies, and consecrated ground while stationary. This is really good for the damage taken, since my consecrated ground lingers thanks to Rational Doctrine. And the regen from standing on it was really useful prior to switching to Dissolution of the Flesh, because while leveling I was relying on Vitality, Regeneration nodes, and Consecrated Ground to replenish my life and offset Reap's life cost. Secondly, I took Righteous Providence. This is just a bunch of crit chance and gives Strength and Intelligence, both desirable stats. Third was Augury of Penitence. Nearby enemies take increased elemental damage and deal less elemental damage. A nice offensive and defensive layer, and it says nearby, but it's quite enormous. It's probably about 3/4 of the screen range, so you're never really too worried about having this on or off. And for the final node, I actually didn't take Inevitable Judgment, since it ignores elemental resistances, and I'm reducing resistances via Exposure, Flammability, Elemental Weakness, and Scorch. Profane Ground also reduces resistances. This actually makes critically striking do less damage when I take it, so instead I opted to take Instruments of Virtue, and this just gives a little bit of extra damage from your main hand weapon. It's otherwise useless. It was useful when I had Volconus in my main hand, but ever since it's just been there as a why not node, because I don't need Pious Path. Consecrated Ground giving ES regen is completely worthless to me, and effects of Consecrated Ground lingering doesn't matter when I get that from Rational Doctrine. For the Wildwood Ascendancy for Warlock, I took Sanguimancy. This is like Blood Magic, removes all mana, makes skills cost life, and makes all of your reservation on life 50% more efficient. This also allows you to take Blood Magic with absolutely no penalty and only the upside of 10% more life. I did end up taking this first. It was a little early. I think I regret doing that. I would not scale into that until I have a little bit more life, because this caused me to die a lot. Like a lot during X. It felt pretty bad. But aside from that, once you're scaled into it, it's not so bad. And Cannibalize Face was my second node because I wanted to rush that to get the life scaling from Reap going ASAP. This is where a ton of extra free damage comes from. And I think at maximum blood charges, it's basically like the equivalent of having a plus 3 or 4 levels to the skill gem, which means that I can have a proper body piece instead of running Diablo's Malefaction for gem levels, giving me a little bit more survivability. And the ability to craft whatever I happen to want on my shirt, which was Fizz taking as Elemental and Energy Shield. Third, I took Blood Hunt. This just lets you eat corpses of creatures to gain a little buff against specific categories of creatures. During mapping, it's kind of nice. It's not super great other than that. I don't care about buying corpses from the vendor to use during bosses, so more or less this is just something I use during mapping when I know there are certain types of mobs in the map. Or, strangely enough, when you roll area is inhabited by a certain creature, that mod is basically the equivalent of having 15% more damage dealt and taken to the entire map. The last node I took is Crimson Power. I pivoted from armor bases to energy shield bases. This at max level, which I am level 100, removes 6 life per level, so I'm losing 600 max life off of this, and I offset that with the energy shield on my gear, which totals about 1500 using some napkin math, and so I lose 600, about 900 life is on my gear, which is, I think, substantially more than you would normally get from just rolling regular life affixes on your gear. Aside from that, the passive tree is quite straightforward. All I'm looking for is just to stack a bunch of life. Starting from the Templar node, if it has life, I path towards it, and because I'm looking for life, I tended towards the bottom side of the tree. This gives us a ton of strength, which also innately gives us quite a bit of life. And the only nodes aside from life that I took are Magmatic Strikes. This is more or less just to get Fire Mastery. Divine Wrath and Divine Judgment, these are damage nodes. I also use Exposure, applies at least 18% to the affected resistance. And since my gloves are minus 11, that gets scaled up, so it's a nice little bump without having to use more expensive currencies since I'm quite poor. And I took the Critical Strike multiplier node up here, and took the Critical Strike multiplier against unique enemies mastery, precision for a little bit of cast speed, and I went down here to Champion of the Cause and Reservation Efficiency for extra reservation efficiency on life. And this Cluster Jewel is just a life Cluster Jewel with Chaos Resistance on it, so I get 15% maximum life off this, as well as 30% Chaos Resistance, which in conjunction with the use of an Amethyst Flask allows me to cap my Chaos Resistance. Without an Amethyst Flask, you'll be looking for Chaos Resistance on your rings, but I chose not to do that, instead opting for the Cluster Jewel. For the keystones that I've allocated, I've taken Avatar Fire for fire conversion. That one is obvious based on the build. Glancing Blows just for a little bit of free mitigation to even out the damage I take. Eternal Youth, use in conjunction with Dissolution of the Flesh. and Iron Will, because this just gives us a little bit of free spell damage since we have over 400 strength. And socketed in here, I have Rational Doctrine. This is to create Profaned Ground. I have Dissolution of the Flesh. I destroyed quite a few of these, double corrupting them, hoping for Corrupted Blood immunity, but I got that from Mageblood on my belt anyways, so I ended up landing on Reduced Curse effect and 1% Elemental Penetration. Quite happy with that. I have That Which Was Taken. I have Phasing on Kill, a chance to cover rare or unique enemies with Ash on hit, and Consecrated Ground you create applies increased damage taken to enemies. By a nice jewel, and I bought this for the reasonable price of about 1 divine. So you can get some pretty good jewels there. I also took Blood Magic down here. Since we have Sanguimancy, this is literally just a 10% more maximum life node. And I also have a Watcher's Eye, which has cast speed while affected by Zealotry, and leeches life while affected by Vitality. I think it would probably, with a little bit more budget, look for increased damage on Consecrated Ground while affected by Zealotry, critical strike multiplier while affected by Precision, and damage leech as life while affected by Vitality as an upgrade to this eye. Because this eye was about 1 divine, and it's okay for what it is. Nothing spectacular. Taking a quick look at the POB. With just maximum blood charges and half Scorch Effect 15 on Guardian or Pinnacle boss, each hit of Reap is doing about 15 million. So with overlaps, that can go anywhere from 15 million to about 60 million damage. If I increase the Scorch Effect, it has us extra million damage. So an extra 4 million with all 4 overlaps if you're able to get it. With Val Reap, you'll get 9 blood charges, and each hit does over 26 million against the Guardian or Pinnacle boss, and against an Uber, that's 8 million, scaled up to 9 with Bottled Faith. Meaning that Uber DPS on this character is about 32 million, and I think it's been quite comfortable. I've been able to do all the Ubers with this, as I had mentioned, and unless I roll something nasty on Exile or Eater of Worlds, they do melt pretty quickly. And while mapping, with max Scorch Effect and about 1 blood charge since you'll be killing stuff, each hit of Reap's doing about 10 million, and we're not really overlapping while clearing, so that's about the DPS you can expect. It clears T16s perfectly well, it's very comfortable, and it's able to handle a little bit of Wildwood juice. I wouldn't recommend doing Wildwood with this build. If you were to do that, you'd probably want to be looking at a better clearing build. But it can do reasonably well. And in terms of tankiness, the physical max hit is quite low because I don't have Taste of Hates or any Fizz taken as conversion aside from a Helm enchant and a Bodycraft. But the elemental hit is, I think, pretty good. And you can see here, with this amount of EHP and with Immortal Call, I'm able to tank multiple Shaper bullets, I can soak Elder Slams, I can get hit by Maven's Fireball, and I won't explode. And on top of that, I can also swap in extra flasks on the Mageblood per the fight. So if I'm fighting Exarch, I can put on a Ruby Flask for a little bit extra fire resist and less damage taken. But of course, you don't need to with a regular belt. And you could also replace Bottled Faith with a Progenesis for even more tankiness, because a Progenesis will increase your EHP significantly and would add well over a quarter to your effective hit pool. As it stands, this build sucks at taking multiple hits, but it's pretty good at taking fewer, bigger hits thanks to the enormous life pool we have. And then we can recover that over 2 seconds by just waiting it out and then soaking another big hit. So I would say this build excels a little bit more at bossing and single target content than it does with very dense content like Simulacrum, Delirium juiced maps with Abyss, like is the meta right now in Affliction League, or just lots of small hits in general from any source. That's about it. POB will be in the description. If you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment, and I will try to respond to the best of my ability. And hopefully you found this useful and have some ideas that you might want to take into your own build when playing the Warlock.